It's often said that within innovation, context is king. And reflecting that, we've decided to situate the start of this conference in a very specific, thematic, and regional way. We begin with a focus on refugees, and particularly Somali refugees in East Africa. And we're doing that for two reasons. Firstly, because it reflects a region and a topic that we're very passionate about in our own work. But secondly, it's extremely important in its own right. And as attention rightly focuses on the humanitarian crisis in the Middle East, we're often neglecting serious crises in other parts of the world, including the current situation of Somali refugees within the region and beyond. So the opening will have two parts. First, we're absolutely delighted to have a keynote address by Ralph Mazou. Ralph is one of the emerging stars of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. He's worked for the organization for over 25 years. He's previously served as the Deputy Director for the Africa Bureau of the organization. He's served as the Deputy Director for the Division of Operational Support. He's worked from the mid-90s in the Great Lakes, across crises in Liberia and Sierra Leone. And today, he is the representative for Kenya, a real challenge in the current security climate and given the humanitarian challenges that the region faces. Once Ralph has delivered the opening keynote, he's kindly agreed to engage in an interactive on-stage dialogue with Moulid Hujal. Moulid is a Somali journalist and indeed a former refugee. Born in Kismayo, he's lived in the Dadaab refugee camps, and today he's a journalist who writes and broadcasts on humanitarian issues. He's worked for the Somali Ministry of Education in Mogadishu and for the United Nations mission as a Somali press officer. Today he lives in London. The ethos behind that is really to encapsulate innovation, to recognize that innovation is built upon dialogue and shared ideas, and the fact that we can learn from one another. So I'd like to welcome both Ralph and Moulid to come up on stage, and I'd like to hand over the floor to Ralph for his keynote address. Ralph, we're delighted that you can open HIP 2015.
Thanks a lot, Alex, for calling me an emerging star. That if you're looking for putting pressure on people before they start talking, that's the best. No, but first I would like to thank you very much to you and to the HIP for inviting me to share some thoughts on innovation. I'm very impressed by the quality and number of people who are here today. I see many friends with whom I've been working for a long time, and I'm very much looking forward to participating in all the sessions, including the dialogue we'll have with Moulid a bit later. I'm also very humbled to be here succeeding our former Deputy High Commissioner, Alex Aleynikov. He was here last year. He is somebody who inspired innovation in the organization. He is the one who spearheaded the creation of an innovation team, which is now led by Olivier Delarue, and a number of other things that he did for the time that he was Deputy High Commissioner. He actually was one of the persons who's held this function for the longest period of time. One thing he said when he was here last year, he talked about innovation, he talked about a number of things, but he said there are times when one needs to do a paradigm shift in the way we deliver programs. And at that time, what he was talking about was the fact that we very much had programs around the world which left refugees in a situation of dependency, and not enough programs which objective was to make refugees self-reliant. So how do we change that? How do we shift that? We very much have been relying on camps, refugee camps, as a way of providing humanitarian assistance to refugees. And if you just take the African continent, it's about 66% of the refugees who are on the continent who have been living in camps. And the assumption was that if you're a refugee and if you are in a camp, you cannot fend for yourself, you cannot respond your own needs. It is either impossible or it is undesirable. The notable exception, of course, and many of you would know it, is Uganda, where refugees are allowed to own plots or to have plots to produce, to cultivate, and are allowed to settle wherever they want in the country. What we've also seen in the history of the organization is there were cases where we did not, in a designed way, we did not try to move to self-reliance, but it actually happened. Refugees, as assistance was going down, refugees started fending for themselves, and camps were gradually transformed into villages. Don't get me wrong, I'm not thinking or I'm not saying that there should never be any refugee camps. There are situations, especially at the start of an emergency situation, where the camp may be the best way of providing assistance to refugees at the beginning of the emergency. If you just take the example of the Somali situation, which Alex referred to, in 2011, we had one of the worst humanitarian crisis with 200,000 people crossing from Somalia into Kenya. And at that point, the best way, or the best initial way of providing humanitarian assistance was to settle refugees in camps, and that is what was done. The thing is also that a number of governments consider that the camp is the best way to make sure that the presence of refugees does not negatively impact on the economy of the country. They believe, rightly or wrongly, that if refugees were to live among the local population, the international community would not provide the support that is necessary. And as a result, these countries would have to shoulder responsibility that is much higher than what they believe that they can shoulder. And as a result, refugees are often settled in arid area, far away from the center, in basically places where nobody really wants to live. But that we've seen, and allow me to take the example of Kenya, has had a number of unintended consequences. The first, and we're giving the example of Dadaab earlier, we've had host population, local population, because of their own needs, who they basically shifted to the camp and decided to live in the camp. They could do that because they share ethnicity, they share clan affiliation with the refugees. Another consequence that we saw in another refugee camp that we have in Kenya, which is the Kakuma camp, we saw the host population moving towards the camp each time they had issues of drought or malnutrition, and basically becoming workers and being employed by the refugees. What we've also seen is the fact that the government, and Kenya is an example for that, considers whole chunks, all parts of the country as being out of bounds and as being outside of their control. And this is one of the reason for the call that many of you may have heard in April, when the Deputy President said that all refugees should go, and actually asked UNHCR to move refugees back to Somalia. The idea behind that was, as government, we do not control that part of the country, so you, UNHCR, you should take responsibility for that. Very last consequence, unintended consequence that you can see, and it has been noticed by our FAO colleagues in South Sudan. They realized that South Sudanese who had lived for a long time, for 20 years in camps, when they were coming back to their country, were not in a position of being part of the economy of their country. They were not in a position, they had lost their skills, and more importantly, their farming skills. Is the camp as a response still possible? We all know and we all agree that it is not desirable. One thing that is now added to the fact that it's not desirable is the fact that it is no longer affordable from a financial point of view. Many of you may have heard, and Alex said it at the beginning, we have now 60 million persons forcibly displaced, and that includes about 20 million refugees and asylum seekers. Our High Commissioner, Antonio Guterres, referred to the system some time ago as being bankrupt. What he said is that the pot of humanitarian resources, humanitarian money, which has basically been shifted around or used to shift around the world to respond to humanitarian needs, is no longer sufficient to provide humanitarian assistance to all the crises we are facing, emerging crisis and old crisis. And what we've also seen, and many of you would attest to that, is it is not possible anymore to ask taxpayers in countries which have traditionally been providing humanitarian assistance to pay more. There are new donors coming forward, especially in the context of the Middle East, but it's definitely not enough to cover all the needs or to cover the gap. There is also a sense that innovation would help. I mean, if you do more with less, it could respond to some of the issues. There also is absolutely not sufficient. And the last is, of course, the private sector, which has been coming forward very much recently. But the dialogues that we have with many members of the private sector, and I've been discussing with Per Hagenes from the IKEA Foundation quite a bit, is they cannot, or it's difficult for them to support and fund a system that is either unsustainable or that doesn't make sense. They either want to have a business-oriented approach or a system that makes sense. And largely, the way we have been providing assistance up to now in camp setting doesn't make sense. I think there is, and we all agree that there is a need for a change. The good news is that change has started. We've had a number of actors, World Bank and other regional banks which were not interested or which believed that it was not their responsibility up to now to be part of a response to a forced displaced situation, but they are coming forward now and saying that indeed they are willing to come forward. So we have to agree and we have to understand that it is illogical and it doesn't make sense to continue operating the way we've been operating with camp. It's important for us to be clear on that. But then we have to make sure that we have an analysis that proposes something else. If governments are unwilling, as I said earlier, if governments are unwilling to have refugees living outside of camp, it's for a reason. And we have to make sure that we explain that it makes more sense from an economic point of view, for the reasons that I mentioned before, the relationship with the host community, for instance, that it makes more sense to have a different type of model. One thing that Alex was talking about in the four themes of the conference was the whole issue of knowledge and the whole issue of metrics, research, evidence. What has been missing is evidence. And the study that Alex and his team, Refugee Economies Rethinking the Popular Assumption on Uganda, is an extremely important start. And it basically says, we may say intuitively that it is not good to have a response that is based on a camp response, but we do not have the tools, we do not have the means to show to government that indeed it is not a response that makes sense for them. For a long time, even the study that I referred to earlier, mainstream economists, if I call them like that, were saying this is humanitarian. There is a humanitarian bias in the way you're collecting the information, and we have to look at it in a different way. So they were not really coming forward. But even that is changing. What has helped, I shouldn't use the word help, but what has definitely changed the way things are done is the situation in Syria, the massive influx that we've seen into neighboring country, and the fact that the response or the way we've been providing responses up to now was not the right one. So in the context of Syria and also in other contexts, economic researchers looking at the impact of the presence of refugees, but also trying to see how assistance to refugees could be provided differently without negatively affecting the host community has been, more of these studies have been carried out. One of these studies, and I will refer to that a bit later, is a study that we have done in the context of Turkana. New partnerships also. I made a reference to the partnership with the private sector. I made also reference to the partnership with the World Bank. We have now a different type of relationship with the World Bank, which is one of the key development actors. And Niels Harrild, who is in the room here, will be saying more about some of what the World Bank has done. But in the context of the Eastern Horn of Africa, a study was conducted recently and managed to identify the development dimension of protracted displacement, also the positive and negative externalities of the presence of refugees and IDPs, and the scope for strategic development intervention to address the need not just of the refugees, but also the IDPs. Partnership with the private sector, I spoke about the reference, made a reference to IKEA, but in the context of Dadaab and Kakuma, the two refugee camps that we have in Kenya, it's about 538,000 people. And this is a market from a private sector point of view. It is an important and an interesting market. The partnership that we've had with IKEA, the purpose of the partnership that we had with IKEA was to, with the IKEA Foundation, was to see how we could transform a camp into a self-reliance settlement. It's a bit of a strange way of putting it, but that was the objective in the context of Doloado. The good news is also that there are a number of new initiatives, new approaches, new way of operating. More and more we look at multi-year programs, which in the humanitarian environment is not something that we do easily. In a refugee situation, it's even more difficult to talk about a multi-year approach. You are asked as UNHCR and as the international community to find a solution to a refugee situation, not to plan for it to occur or to happen for a long period of time. There are many new approaches that has to be looked into. Last week I was in a workshop organized by IGAD, the regional organization that covers a number of countries in the Horn of Africa. And their approach was to look at borderland areas. And they realized a number of things. These are areas which often are forgotten by government, but it's also areas or parts of the country which host refugees. If you try looking at these areas together, regardless of the border, what can be done? If you look at common history, if you look at common culture, if you look at common interest, what more could be done in having programs that addresses the needs on both sides of the border? And there, they want to see, and all participants were looking refugees as people who should actually be seen as an asset to the region rather than to be seen as a burden. A last thing that is very new, and Niels will probably say more about that, for the first time this year, countries are envisaging the possibility of borrowing money to build or infrastructures in refugee hosting areas. And these countries are Djibouti, Tanzania, Uganda, Ethiopia. A few months ago, it was inconceivable that they would go and borrow money, even if it's concessional rates, even if it's a long period of time, borrow money for refugee hosting areas. That shows that a number of countries have now understood that depending on how you provide assistance in refugee areas, you can actually benefit from that. We'll be talking about new technologies. These are things which are actually helping us in the context in which we are. I was checking, and in the 80s, early 80s, a mobile phone was about $4,000 or so. Today, it is a protection tool that we are actually providing to Somali refugees when they cross the border into their country, and it costs about $20. So that shows us how new technology in the context of our search for innovation is also changing the environment in which we are. The phone is seen as something that can be used primarily to respond to humanitarian needs, true, but it's also something that helps refugees being part of the economy of the country where they are. It formalizes some of their activities. In Kenya, there is a mobile transfer system called M-Pesa, which is helping a number of refugees to actually have a de facto bank account and then be able to trade and exchange. They also have access to microcredits through this telephone. They have access to energy and a number of other things. Before I conclude, I would like to say a few words about an initiative that we launched in November last year, which we call the Turkana Initiative. Turkana is part of the country, part of Kenya. I'm looking at the map to see if I can show it there. It's the place where you see 54,000 people. That's the area. It's one of the largest counties in Kenya. We have a camp which has been there since the 90s, 1991 or so. There are about 185,000 people in that camp. And one of the striking characteristics of the Turkana County is the condition of the host population. It's one of the counties which has the highest level of poverty in the whole of Kenya. It's a country which has the highest, one of the highest level of illiteracy. That's the environment in which we are. And as I said earlier, often host population move to camps to have access to some resources. So we did organize a roundtable in November last year, and our objective was to see, is it possible to take full account of the refugee economy, take full account of the host economy, and see how both economies can be integrated, with the objective later on of strengthening the local economy and moving refugees out of dependency into self-reliance. Sounds extremely ambitious as an objective. But the good thing is the county government in Turkana considers that this is a good objective because they consider that the refugee population could actually help them develop their economy. As I said, you have 185,000 people with a lot of knowledge, with a lot of skills, with a lot of experience. How can they help the host community? They are in a setting that is a quasi-urban setting. So is there a way to transform that setting in something different? We, on the 19th of June, just the day before World Refugee Day, we were granted 15 square kilometers of additional land on which we can settle refugees. We will therefore decongest the existing camps that we have, and we will try and see if what I described earlier can be designed. Lots of questions, of course, lots of uncertainties, but with the work that has been done, with some of the work that Alex and his team did, with the study that is being carried out right now with the World Bank in Turkana on measuring the impact of the presence of refugees. With all this, we believe that it is possible to try and design a new approach, a new model. The objective being that after a certain number of years, most refugees would be self-reliant in that context. As I said, it may sound ambitious, but if you look at the environment, if you look at the surrounding, if you look at the fact that a paved road, a new tarmac road is being built from Juba to Lamu in Kenya, for some of you who've been to Kenya, it is, Kakuma may and will become something else, and therefore has a tremendous economic potential. But again, for that, we have to completely change our mindset and say that it's not because you find yourself in a refugee situation that you should sit in a camp, and that it is more preferable for the government and for the host community to tap on the talent of refugees. This is in the context in which we are in Kenya and in Turkana. It may not be the case in other locations, it may not be the case in other places, but in the Turkana context and in the Kenya context, we believe that this is something that will indeed help the environment. As I said, we hope it will work. There are a number of things. The disparity between host population and refugee population is quite large. The feeling that the host population may have that their land or their resources are being taken away from them, it also needs to be addressed. The fact that a number of refugees will believe that if they become self-reliant, the possibility for them to be resettled will be lower is also something that one needs to take into consideration. And of course, the resistance of interest, which have been fairly comfortable the way things were, and nobody can discard the possibility for them and for these to negatively impact on the change. To conclude, when one looks at innovation as compared or in relation to something which is seen as tradition and one of the oldest tradition of civilization, providing asylum, we now see that it is actually through innovative approach, through thinking differently, that will actually be able to preserve one of the oldest institutions. That's what we are seeing. It's not just in the context of Kenya, but we need to think differently to protect asylum, to protect refugees, and that's what we should all keep in mind. It is possible. It is things that we all see happening. It requires, as Alex was saying earlier, partnership, coming together, but it's definitely something that we can do. I've been longer than I should have been, but I would like to stop here and thank you very much.
Thank you, Ralph, for that brilliant exposition of the challenges you face in the region, but also that glint of optimism and hope that we can move towards self-reliance. I think in conceiving this follow-up panel, what we had in mind was, as the Deputy High Commissioner for Refugees said in his keynote address last year, we can perhaps think about innovation as iterative problem-solving amongst friends. It relies upon dialogue, and it relies particularly upon humanitarian organizations being willing to speak to representatives of the communities they seek to serve. And so I'm really glad that Moulid has agreed to begin by asking Ralph some questions, that Ralph will in turn ask Moulid some questions, and they will then engage in an on-stage dialogue. Moulid, over to you.
Thank you very much, Alexandra. So Ralph, I would like to start my questions and dialogue about Dadaab. The Dadaab refugee camps has been hosting Somali refugees for more than 2 decades now. But what started as a temporary solution for the Somali refugees fleeing the conflict in neighboring Somalia in 1991 has unfortunately turned out to be the world's largest refugee camp. Now with third generation children, as you know, growing up there, born by parents who are themselves born there. And the Kenya government does not allow them to integrate into the Kenyan society. They don't provide them with work permits. They're not allowed to move outside the camp. Currently, over 350,000 people living there. What are the long-term plans for UNHCR in the future for these people?
No, thanks, Moulid. Indeed, as you said, it is one that has been described as the largest refugee camp. Dadaab has been described as the largest refugee camp. But I would say that the first thing that we need to do, we need to say, is to reaffirm the fact that Kenya has been providing asylum to a large number of refugees. The approach, as I said in my remarks earlier, in Kenya and in a number of other countries, has been to believe that the camp was the best approach, and that it was better to have refugees living in camp and then wait until they could return. But that was done in a context where it was felt or it was thought that asylum would not last for such a long time. Some refugees have been in Dadaab for the past 20 years, 24 years, and some of them will probably never want to return to their place of origin. Some of them may not even be able to go back to their place of origin. But I would say more importantly, what we've noticed is that a number of refugees are interested in going back to their country, but are asking for a number of things. They're asking for access to basic services inside Somalia, in safe parts of Somalia, and they're also asking us to see the repatriation in an innovative way, and not as an event which will only take place later on. They're asking us to look at the return of refugees, the flow, the back and forth movement that is happening in a different way. I think that is something that we need to look at also. We need to look at solutions more actively than we've been doing so far.
Thank you. My second question is about the energy, especially with cooking. It's a big problem for the residents there. WFP provides food, which is good, but they need something to cook with. There are no currently active firewood distribution, and there's been a lot of issues with the host community. And I remember there was this story of a woman, a mother, a pregnant mother, a very tragic story that I documented with one of the environmental NGO agency in the Dab in 2012. That she was one of these climate refugees who came in 2012 in the outskirts of one of the camps, and she went to look for firewood, and one of these local host community member was trying to chase her away to stop her from degrading the environment in that context. But she ran away, and there were issues of women raped in that process, and she fell down several times, and the woman unfortunately passed away later. And according to some of the women witnesses, said the man was not actually going to rape her, but of course he wanted to save his environment. She wanted something to cook with, and since they are not allowed to collect firewood, what other alternative energy source, or how can we address this? And what have you been doing to help with this?
Yeah, one of the things that the host community is complaining the most about is environmental degradation. And while initially from 91 to 97, when the camp was set up, it was possible to find firewood in the immediate vicinity of the camp. But the more refugees stayed, the more the camp grew, the further away one needed to go to find firewood. And now the distance that people have to walk to get firewood is huge. We're talking about several tens of kilometers that one has to walk. Initially, we were providing, and firewood was available easily around the camps. It's up to 97 or so. But since then, there have been difficulties. Initially, we could provide. We had the means to provide the firewood. We had a donation which allowed us to go and procure firewood and then distribute it to the population. But then that funding disappeared. And for a long period of time, a number of incidents, such as the one you described, took place. What we're doing now is, and what started in 2013, 2014, is to try and start looking at alternative sources of fuel for cooking, looking at ethanol. That's one of the options that is being looked at. And at the same time provide firewood to some vulnerable population. That's something that we're still doing, and that has continued. But if there is one place where innovation is required, is precisely this. If we continue to have camps where full assistance is being provided, one of the things which also should be provided is firewood. And in the camp setup, it is more and more impossible. If we were in a situation where refugees were self-reliant, they would be in a position of buying energy-saving stoves, and they would be able to also buy alternative sources of fuel. But right now, in the system in which we are, it has to be provided by the international community. So the true response to that is to move towards an environment, a system, and a model of assistance that would be based more on self-reliance. On the self-reliance, would have as an objective the self-reliance of refugees, rather than the model that we have, which is, again, completely unsustainable. So to respond specific to your question, it's targeting specific families, specific groups, vulnerable groups, with the limited resources that we have, and try to move away from this system of dependency.
Thank you very much. Just to the last point I would like to discuss with you is about the refugee youth, especially the Somali refugees who in the region. They have limited opportunities to get further education or even higher education. And these people are the ones who we expect to go back to their country and go back with the skills and capacity to rebuild so that they can be part of the reconstruction and refugees can go back. What can we do to provide greater opportunities for these youth who are the potential leaders of their countries of origin?
The first thing is that as a result, or with the resources that we're getting from the international community, we now have about 50% of the children of school-going age who are actually attending school at primary level, secondary level. And we also have some refugees attending tertiary education, either in various universities inside Kenya, but also as a result of new innovative approaches of distance learning through using the internet and various new technology. And a number of colleagues here, and I saw Professor Moser from the Geneva University, who has also been working on a project which allows distance learning. There are many universities from all over the world which are trying to provide education at the highest level to refugees for the reasons that you've mentioned. First, it allows refugees to be on the market in the country, in Kenya, and a number of refugees are actually working in Kenya. And it also allows a number of refugees who've been in Dadaab for a long period of time to go back to Somalia and to actually be employed when they are back in Somalia. So the education that is being provided in the camp is not lost, and it actually provides refugees with an opportunity to seek a durable solution. The numbers I've mentioned, however, 50% at the primary level. I think at the secondary level it falls to 30 or so percent, or even lower than that. And then, so it's as a result of the very limited resources that we have. If more resources were provided for education, more learners would be able to have access. One thought that has been mentioned recently, which we'll probably try and pursue, is to use one of the hospitals we have in Dadaab to teach students to provide health worker training, which is something that would benefit them in Kenya, but also would benefit them in Somalia. So these are the things that are being looked into. Of course, the issue is, of course, availability of resources.
Thank you very much. I think that's all I have to discuss with Ras. If you have any...
No, Mulit, first, it was good we had our first discussion before coming here, and I heard a bit about your own story. You were in Dadaab. Yeah. You got some education while you were in Dadaab from 1999 to 2013. Then you went back to Somalia. You worked in Somalia, and then you had to flee from Somalia. So you are among those who have actually returned to Somalia. So if you could say a few words about what you think of that return, what are the problems, and if you can say also a few words about the pilot project that we have implemented some time ago.
Well, the pilot project, to start with the repatriation, refugees in Dadaab have long started going back to Somalia, even before the repatriation process started. And because of the different categories of people, different groups of refugees who live there, those who came in 2011, running away from the famine in 2011, have went back when the rains started. But the long-term residents who got some education and who stayed there for a long time are now looking back for opportunities back home. And the youth have opted to go back, assess the situation, and got some employment. And then later, some of their families joined them. And this is happening in areas that are now controlled by the government. Then the repatriation of a whole family with children and vulnerable women may not be easy, because what happens is these young men go alone without informing UNHCR, because they still want to have that social security of their refugee status when they can come back and look for opportunities in the cities in Mogadishu, Kismayo, and Garowe, in Puntland, in northern, the safe regions, and see if they can get opportunity and then come and take their families back. So mostly they get retained there. And it's unlikely for them to come back, because most of the times you'll find they get employment. And so I think for the youth, yes, repatriation is possible, because they can easily go and come back. Mm. But for the women and children, I think it's not safe for them to return.
So looking at the pilot project, what would you do differently, or what do you think we should do differently to actually provide a true durable solution for people who would like to return?
Well, like I said, when these young men go, most of the times, even though they struggle the first few months, because it's mostly they don't get a contract and go directly. They first of all go without securing a job, look for, and then the first few months is a really difficult time to adjust to the environment, pay their own bills, with not getting any support. And then, but if they come through UNHCR and they are formalized, given this support package, to go and do the assessment, and then later, even if they don't get a job, with this support package, take their families after getting used to the place. I think that will be one way. Mm-hmm. And giving more information to the refugees. Now, I understand there is the UNHCR help desk where people come seek for information, but I'll suggest that UNHCR do more outreach campaign within the community, and specifically focusing on the youth, to link them with their UNHCR partners in Somalia and other implementing humanitarian agencies, so that they can come through this process instead of just going and risking on their own. That will be one way of doing it.
Thank you. Maybe last one on durable solutions. Do you think, or what do you think of the possibility of asking for some of the refugees, possibility of working while they are in Kenya as one of the way forward?
That's one of the most interesting things, and that's what they have been longing for. I would really suggest that UNHCR talks to the Kenyan government to change their policy and provide these refugee youth integration opportunities to get work permits and work, because they will really be helping build the economy, and they will not be a burden. I understand there is the security situation and aspect, but if they selectively give those that have got education the work permits, and those families registered with UNHCR with their families and integrate them to the Kenyan society, this will be a durable solution. And then later, when Somalia fully becomes okay for them to go back, and then they can go back. So the issue of integration and freedom of movement would be very important, and I will stress that UNHCR puts more pressure on the Kenyan government to accept these people as agents of change, but not as a burden and a security threat.
Can I just ask you one question, both of you, just to finish off this session? How do you think that dialogues like this can continue and become part of humanitarian practice? What would need to happen to ensure that in the region and more globally, humanitarian organizations like UNHCR can better engage the ideas and perspectives of communities like the Somali community?
Please.
I think it's happening. I think I think it's happening. I think we have dialogue on a regular basis. But I think more importantly, it cannot be, the dialogue between UNHCR and refugees is an interesting dialogue, But the main dialogue is UNHCR, refugees, and the countries which are providing asylum. Because at the end of the day, the most important thing that we're talking about is providing asylum. How can we make sure that governments around the world continue to provide asylum at a time when more and more they say that their internal security does not allow them to. So it is, just to reassure you, such dialogues are taking place every day as we're speaking now. I'm sure somewhere there is this kind of dialogue. It has to be broadened. It shouldn't be just UNHCR and refugees. It should be governments, it should be all the other organizations. I mean, the NGOs are frontline, if I can put it that way, in that dialogue, of course. But it's to broaden, to have more people having that dialogue, but also redefining what we're talking about. And what are we trying to achieve? I think it's possible to have an objective, a common objective that is workable for all those who are stakeholders in that.
Yeah, I'll really agree with the point of make sure the host community, the host country is really part of this program. And like you mentioned earlier in your keynote address, that the Kenyan government is kind of saying, UNHCR, these are your people, these are the ones. They have that mentality of putting all the blame on you and asking you to take over or take responsibility of these people, instead of standing by your side to support these people. So the governments that are hosting refugees are really very important part of the dialogue, and they need to change their attitude and be part of the discussion where they give the refugees a way out of these protracted situations. And not only the government, actually, also the humanitarian industry should be also coming together, and the development and the emergency to work together to make sure that they really take these people out of this situation.
Maybe if you allow me to add, in the room here down there, there is a gentleman called Ken Okoth, who is the Member of Parliament for Kibera in Nairobi, and he's been a very strong defender of human rights in Kenya. So there is at least one government who is monitoring that dialogue, just for you to know.
That's fantastic to know. Thank you both of you, Ralph and Moulid, for a fantastic opening to the conference.